Nathan and I had been planning our wedding for months, carefully curating every detail, from the color of the flowers to the flavor of the cake. But as the big day approached, he suggested something unexpected. "Why don't we spend a few weeks at my family's estate before the wedding?" he asked one evening, his eyes bright with excitement. "It's peaceful, and it'll give us a chance to recharge before everything gets hectic." The idea sounded perfect. I'd seen pictures of the estate, sprawling green fields, a grand old house perched on a hill, and the kind of tranquility that seemed to belong in another time. "That sounds amazing," I said, already imagining long walks and quiet mornings. Nathan beamed. "You'll love it. And you'll finally get to meet Lucas." "Lucas?" I asked, tilting my head. "My older brother," Nathan explained.
He runs the estate now.
"He's a bit intense, but once you get to know him, you'll see he has a good heart." When we pulled up the gravel driveway a week later, the estate was even more breathtaking than I'd imagined. Rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, the fields glowing under the golden light of late afternoon. The house itself was a masterpiece of old-world charm, its stone facade softened by ivy that climbed its walls. Nathan reached over and squeezed my hand. "You're going to love it here, Ellie." I smiled, but as we stepped out of the car, a flicker of nervousness settled in my chest. Meeting Nathan's family felt monumental, as if their approval could make or break the future we were building together. The front door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. He looked nothing like Nathan, his sharp features and piercing gaze giving him an air of authority that was almost intimidating. "So, this is Ellie," the man said, his voice smooth but carrying a subtle edge. Nathan grinned, wrapping an arm around my waist. "Lucas, this is my fiancé. Ellie, meet my big brother." I extended a hand, feeling a flicker of nerves. "It's nice to meet you." Lucas took my hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. "Welcome to the family," he said, though his tone made the words feel less like a greeting and more like a challenge. That night, Nathan's parents hosted a small dinner to celebrate our arrival. The dining room was grand, its high ceilings adorned with chandeliers that cast a warm glow over the long table. "So, Ellie," Nathan's mother said, her eyes sparkling, "what are you most excited about for the wedding?" I hesitated, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze. "Just starting our life together," I said with a smile. Nathan reached for my hand, his touch reassuring. "She's going to make the perfect bride." Lucas, seated across from us, raised his glass. "To the happy couple," he said, though his tone was hard to read. Our eyes met briefly, and something about the way he looked at me made my pulse quicken. The house was silent that night, its stillness punctuated by the occasional creak of old floorboards. Unable to sleep, I made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water. I wasn't expecting to find Lucas there, leaning against the counter with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. "No," I admitted, feeling awkward under his steady gaze. He watched me as I poured a glass of water, his presence filling the room in a way that made it hard to think. "Nathan's lucky," he said suddenly, his tone unreadable. I looked up, startled. "Why do you say that?" Lucas's lips curved into a faint smile. "Because you're here. You seem different." "Different how?" I asked cautiously. He shrugged, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Just different. In a good way." The air between us felt charged, and I quickly excused myself, retreating to the safety of Nathan's room. Over the next few days, I tried to dismiss the strange tension I felt around Lucas. He was polite, helpful even, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made my heart race. One afternoon, while Nathan was out running errands, I found myself alone in the garden, trimming roses with Nathan's mother. Lucas appeared out of nowhere, his presence as unsettling as ever. "Need a hand?" he asked, his gaze lingering on mine. "I think we've got it covered," I said, forcing a smile. "Suit yourself," he said with a smirk, but he didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the garden wall, his arms crossed as he watched me work. The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable, and when I accidentally pricked my finger on a thorn, he was at my side in an instant. "Careful," he said, taking my hand. His touch was warm, and I felt a shiver run through me as he examined the tiny wound. "It's nothing," I said, pulling my hand away. Lucas's eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then he stepped back, his expression unreadable. The next morning, Nathan was gone before I woke up, a note on the nightstand explaining that he and his father had gone to finalize some wedding logistics in town. I stretched, enjoying the quiet of the estate, and decided to take a walk through the grounds. The air was cool, the kind of crisp morning that promised a warm afternoon. The fields stretched endlessly before me, the golden light of the early sun casting long shadows. As I wandered toward the barn, I noticed Lucas standing by the fence, his back to me. "Good morning," I called out, hesitating a few feet away. Lucas turned, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You're up early." "So are you," I countered, stepping closer. "Farm life," he said with a shrug. "The animals don't care what time you went to bed." His tone was light, but there was a shadow in his eyes, a weight I couldn't ignore. "Do you ever get tired of it?" I asked, gesturing to the fields. Lucas's gaze followed mine, and for a moment, he didn't answer. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it's not the farm I get tired of. It's everything else." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Nothing. Just thinking out loud." But it wasn't nothing. His words lingered with me as I walked back to the house, the memory of his gaze sending a shiver through me. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas was everywhere. He always seemed to appear at just the right moment, offering to carry a heavy box, appearing with a tray of drinks when we were out in the garden, or sitting silently in the corner of the room, watching. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. There was something in the way he looked at me, something that made my heart race and my stomach twist. I tried to brush it off, to focus on Nathan and the wedding, but Lucas's presence was like a shadow I couldn't escape. One evening, after Nathan and his parents had gone to a meeting with the caterer, I found myself alone in the library. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room, and I curled up in one of the armchairs with a book. I was so absorbed in the story that I didn't hear Lucas enter until he spoke. "Good book." I jumped, nearly dropping it. "You scared me." "Sorry," he said, though the smirk on his face suggested otherwise. He crossed the room and settled into the chair opposite mine, a glass of whiskey in hand. For a moment, we sat in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire. "You seem different here," he said suddenly. I frowned. "Different how?" Lucas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "More relaxed. Happier, maybe." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "It's a beautiful place," I said finally. He nodded but didn't take his eyes off me. "Nathan's lucky." The way he said it made my pulse quicken. "Lucas." "Don't," he interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not trying to start anything. I wanted you to know." The tension between us lingered long after he left the room. That night, as I lay in bed beside Nathan, I couldn't stop thinking about the look in Lucas's eyes, the weight of his words. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, Lucas found me in the garden, trimming roses with Nathan's mother. He offered to help, and before I could protest, he had a pair of shears in hand. We worked side by side in silence, the sound of snipping filling the air. "Ellie," he said suddenly, his voice low. I glanced at him, startled by the seriousness in his tone. "Yes." He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the rosebush in front of him. I think you should know something." "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. Lucas turned to me, his eyes dark and intense. "I don't think Nathan deserves you." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. "You're incredible, Ellie," he said, stepping closer. "And he doesn't see it. Not the way I do." Lucas's words echoed in my mind long after I left the garden. My hands trembled as I returned to the house, the rose trimmings I'd gathered scattered on the ground in my haste.
How dare he?
The thought repeated over and over, but beneath my anger was something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge. Nathan was waiting for me in the kitchen, a cheerful smile lighting up his face. "There you are. I was just about to come looking for you." "Sorry," I said, forcing a smile. "I lost track of time in the garden." Nathan kissed my forehead, his touch warm and comforting. "Well, don't work too hard. You've got a wedding to enjoy, remembers?" I nodded, my throat tight. As he walked away, I couldn't help but wonder what he'd think if he knew what Lucas had said, if he knew the storm brewing between his brother and me. The tension between Lucas and me only grew in the days that followed. Every glance felt charged, every word heavy with unspoken meaning. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself walking along the edge of the property, the cool breeze doing little to calm my restless thoughts. I was startled to hear footsteps behind me and turned to see Lucas approaching. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice low. "I needed some air," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. Lucas stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I'm sorry if I upset you the other day," he said, his gaze steady. "You think an apology fixes this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You've made things so complicated, Lucas." He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Because I told you the truth." I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came. Before I could stop him, Lucas reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. "Ellie," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me you don't feel it too?" My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I was frozen, trapped between what I knew was right and what I couldn't deny. "This is wrong," I said, pulling my hand away. "Is it?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "Or are you just too scared to admit it?" "Stop it, Lucas," I snapped, my voice shaking. "I'm marrying Nathan. He's your brother." Lucas's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't name. "Maybe you're right," he said finally. "But that doesn't change how I feel." That night, I couldn't sleep. Lucas's words played over and over in my mind, their weight pressing down on me until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I found myself wandering the halls of the estate, my footsteps light against the creaking wood. When I reached the library, the sight of Lucas sitting by the fire stopped me in my tracks. He looked up as I entered, his expression a mix of surprise and something else, something deeper. "I couldn't sleep," I said softly, moving toward him. "Neither could I," he replied, his voice low. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying. And then, without thinking, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than an answer. But it quickly deepened, the flood of emotions too powerful to contain. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, forgetting everything but the feel of his touch. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless. "This can't happen," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But it already has," Lucas replied, his eyes locked on mine. The days following that night were a blur of guilt, tension, and stolen glances. Lucas and I avoided each other as much as we could, but the weight of what had happened lingered, a silent presence in every room. Nathan remained blissfully unaware, caught up in the whirlwind of last-minute wedding details. His happiness only deepened my guilt, the weight of my betrayal suffocating. One afternoon, as I stood in the garden trimming roses, Lucas appeared, his presence as unsettling as ever. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "I don't think there's anything left to say," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the flowers. "There's plenty left to say," he insisted, stepping closer. "We can't just pretend nothing happened." "Why not?" I snapped, finally looking at him. "It's not like it changes anything. I'm still marrying Nathan." Lucas's jaw tightened. "Do you really believe that? That you can just go back to pretending everything's fine?" Before I could respond, Nathan's voice called out from the house. "Ellie? Lucas? Where are you?" Panic surged through me, and I quickly turned away, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the roses. "We're in the garden," Lucas called back, his tone steady. Nathan appeared a moment later, his face lighting up when he saw me. "There you are. I was looking for you. What's up?" I asked, forcing a smile. "I wanted to show you the seating chart," he said, holding up a clipboard. I nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Let's go inside." As we walked back to the house, I could feel Lucas's eyes on me, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. That evening, I found myself alone in the library again. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I curled up in one of the armchairs, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I didn't hear Lucas enter until he spoke. "Ellie." I jumped, my heart racing as I looked up at him. "What are you doing here?" "We can't keep avoiding this," he said, his tone firm. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, standing up. He moved closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Stop lying to yourself. You feel it too. I know you do." "Lucas, please," I whispered, tears pricking at my eyes. "This has to stop." "Then tell me you don't feel anything for me," he challenged. "Look me in the eye and tell me." I opened my mouth, but no words came. The next morning, as the wedding drew closer, the tension between Lucas and me reached its breaking point. I found him in the barn, his hands clenched into fists as he paced back and forth. "We can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not fair to Nathan." "Do you love him?" Lucas demanded, stopping in his tracks.
What kind of question is that?
I shot back, anger flaring. "A simple one," he said, his tone harsh. "Do you love him?" I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucas stepped closer, his expression softening. "Then why are you marrying him?" "Because it's the right thing to do," I said, tears streaming down my face. "The right thing," Lucas echoed bitterly. "For who? For him? Or for you?" Before I could respond, Nathan's voice echoed from outside the barn. "Ellie? Are you in there?" Lucas and I froze, the weight of the moment crashing down around us. The following morning, guilt settled over me like a suffocating fog. Nathan's warmth beside me in bed felt almost unbearable, a reminder of the line I had crossed. "Big day today," Nathan said, his voice cheerful as he stretched. "Cater tasting, final flower arrangements, and Dad's making us a special dinner tonight. Think you can keep up?" I forced a smile. Of course, but inside, I felt like I was crumbling. At breakfast, Lucas sat across the table from me, his gaze lingering just a second too long. Every time his eyes met mine, my stomach twisted. Nathan, oblivious, was chattering excitedly about the cake flavors he wanted to try. "Ellie, you'll love the chocolate ganache one. It's got this." "I'm sure it's perfect," I said quickly, cutting him off before my voice could betray me. Lucas's smirk was barely perceptible, but I caught it. I clenched my hands in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. The hours passed in a blur. Nathan and I met with a caterer, walked through the garden with his mother, and finalized seating arrangements. Through it all, I felt like I was sleepwalking, my mind elsewhere. That evening, the family gathered in the dining room for the promised special dinner. The table was set with fine china, and the scent of roasted vegetables and fresh bread filled the air. As we sat down, Nathan's father raised a glass. "To Nathan and Ellie," he said, his voice warm. "May your life together be as strong and beautiful as this estate." "To Nathan and Ellie," everyone echoed, their glasses clinking. Lucas's voice was the last to join in, his eyes fixed on me as he took a slow sip of wine. After dinner, I excused myself, claiming I needed some air. The cool night breeze was a relief as I stepped onto the patio, my head spinning from the wine and the weight of the day. I wasn't alone for long. "You're avoiding me," Lucas said, his voice low as he approached from the shadows. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "What do you want, Lucas?" "To talk," he replied, stepping closer. "You've been pretending nothing happened, but we both know that's a lie." I crossed my arms, trying to steel myself. "It was a mistake. It won't happen again." "Is that what you really believe?" he asked, his gaze intense. Yes, I said, though my voice faltered. He moved closer, so close I could feel the heat of his body. Then why can't you even look at me without blushing? Stop it, I whispered, my voice trembling. I can't, he said, his voice rough. Not when I know you feel it too. Before I could respond, Lucas's lips were on mine, his kiss desperate and unrelenting. I wanted to push him away, to scream at him to stop, but my body betrayed me. My hands tangled in his shirt, pulling him closer even as tears streamed down my cheeks. When we finally broke apart, I was shaking. This is wrong, I said, my voice barely audible. But it's real, Lucas countered, his eyes blazing. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I turned and fled into the house, leaving him standing alone in the dark. The morning after, the weight of what had happened between Lucas and me pressed down on my chest like a heavy stone. I avoided the mirror as I dressed, too ashamed to meet my own reflection. Nathan was already up and out by the time I made my way downstairs, leaving the house eerily quiet. I found Lucas in the garden, tending to the rose bushes we'd worked on just days before. His shirt was damp with sweat, the morning sun casting a golden glow over his features. When he saw me, he straightened, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. Lucas set down his shears, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I know," he replied. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. "What happened last night? It can't happen again," I said finally. Lucas's jaw tightened, and he looked away. "Why not? Because of Nathan?" "Yes," I said, my voice breaking. "Because of Nathan. Because it's wrong, Lucas." He turned back to me, his eyes blazing with emotion. "You can keep telling yourself that, Ellie, but it doesn't change the truth. What we feel, it's real." Nathan returned later that afternoon, his mood as cheerful as ever. I forced a smile as he recounted his errands, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying Lucas's words over and over. At dinner, the tension between Lucas and me was palpable. Every glance felt like a secret, every word heavy with unspoken meaning. Nathan's mother, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, beamed at us from across the table. "I can't wait for the wedding," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "It's going to be beautiful." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thank you." Lucas didn't say a word, his focus fixed on his plate. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the weight of my choices threatened to crush me. Nathan slept soundly beside me, his face peaceful and untroubled. I couldn't do this. I couldn't marry him while my heart was in turmoil. Slipping out of bed, I padded down the hall, my footsteps silent against the wooden floor. I found Lucas in the library, a book open in his lap, though his eyes weren't on the pages. "You're awake," he said, his voice low. "So are you," I replied, stepping into the room. Lucas closed the book, setting it aside. "What's on your mind, Ellie?" I hesitated, my hands twisting in the fabric of my robe. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucas stood, crossing the room in a few quick strides. "You do," he said, his hands gently gripping my shoulders. "You just don't want to admit it." Tears welled in my eyes as I looked up at him. "It's not that simple." "It is," he insisted, his voice firm. "Do you love him?" The question hit me like a blow, and I realized I couldn't answer it. The next morning, everything came crashing down. Nathan found me in the garden, his face pale and his hands shaking as he held up my phone. "Who is he?" he demanded, his voice breaking. I froze, my blood running cold. "Nathan, Don't lie to me, Ellie," he shouted, his eyes filled with pain. "I saw the messages. Just tell me the truth." My heart shattered as I realized there was no way out. "It's Lucas," I said quietly, my voice trembling. Nathan's face crumpled, and he stumbled back as if I'd struck him. "How could you?" he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion and tension. I avoided Lucas as much as I could, throwing myself into wedding preparations and clinging to Nathan's easy, cheerful energy. But no matter how hard I tried to pretend, I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch between Lucas and me felt like a spark waiting to ignite. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Nathan was oblivious, his excitement for the wedding infectious. His parents continued their meticulous planning, and the estate buzzed with the anticipation of guests arriving soon. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. One evening, I stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic motion of the knife against the cutting board was soothing, a welcome distraction from my thoughts. Lucas walked in, his presence filling the room. He didn't speak at first, just stood there watching me. "Do you need something?" I asked, not looking up. "Yes," he said simply. I froze, the knife poised midair. "Lucas, don't." "Don't what?" he asked, stepping closer. "Don't tell you the truth? Don't admit how I feel?" I turned to face him, my hands trembling. "This has to stop. Whatever this is, it can't happen." He stepped closer still, his gaze intense. "But it already has. You can't deny it, Ellie. I see it in the way you look at me." "I love Nathan," I said, though my voice wavered. Lucas's lips curved into a sad smile.
Do you?
"Or do you just love the idea of him? The safety, the simplicity." His words hit like a slap, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "That's enough," I said, my voice trembling. He stepped back, his expression softening. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to hurt you." The breaking point came the next day. Nathan had gone into town, leaving me alone at the estate. I was in the barn, organizing decorations for the ceremony, when Lucas appeared. "Ellie," he said, his voice low. I sighed, turning to face him. "Lucas, I don't have time for this right now." "You're marrying him tomorrow," he said, ignoring my words. "And you're going to spend the rest of your life pretending this didn't happen. Pretending you don't feel what I feel." "Stop it," I snapped, my voice shaking. "You don't know what I feel." "Yes, I do," he said, stepping closer. "Because I feel it too." Before I could respond, he reached for me, his hands framing my face as his lips met mine. It was a kiss filled with desperation and longing, a last-ditch effort to hold on to something that was already slipping away. I pushed him away, my chest heaving. "This is wrong," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But it's real," he replied, his voice breaking. That evening, as the sun set over the estate, I found Lucas in the garden. He was sitting on the stone bench where we'd first spoken, his head bowed and his shoulders slumped. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Where will you go?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't stay here." Lucas stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Ellie?" "Don't," I said, shaking my head. "It's over, Lucas. Whatever this was, it has to end." He stepped closer, his gaze searching mine. "I'll let you go," he said finally. "But know this. No matter where you go or what you do, you'll always have a piece of me." Tears spilled down my cheeks as I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the fading light. The kiss lingered in my mind, haunting me with its intensity and the undeniable truth it carried. I avoided Lucas for the next few days, throwing myself into wedding preparations with Nathan. His excitement was infectious, but it only deepened my guilt. "Ellie, you've been amazing through all of this," Nathan said one evening as we reviewed seating arrangements. "I don't know how I got so lucky." I smiled weakly, my heart aching. "You're the lucky one? Nathan, you've been nothing but wonderful." He reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "Just a little longer and we'll be husband and wife." The night before the wedding, Nathan's parents hosted a rehearsal dinner. The house buzzed with laughter and excitement, everyone eager for the big day. Lucas, however, was a shadow in the background, his presence unsettling despite his silence. I avoided his gaze all evening, but as the night wound down, I found him waiting for me in the garden. "You're really going through with this?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. What choice do I have? I snapped, my frustration bubbling to the surface. You made your feelings clear, but this isn't just about us, Lucas. It's about Nathan. It's about his family. It's about you, he countered, stepping closer. And what you want. Can you really marry him knowing how you feel? Tears stung my eyes as I looked away. This isn't fair, I whispered. None of this is fair. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. The estate was transformed into a fairy tale setting, with white roses lining the aisle and soft music playing in the background. My bridesmaids fussed over my dress, their chatter filling the room as I stared at my reflection. The woman in the mirror looked perfect, but inside, I was anything but. A knock at the door startled me, and one of the bridesmaids poked her head in. It's time. My heart pounded as I walked down the stairs, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. When I reached the aisle, Nathan was waiting, his face glowing with love and anticipation. The ceremony began, the officiant's voice a distant hum as he led us through the vows. Nathan's eyes never left mine, his gaze filled with a warmth that only deepened my turmoil. Do you, Eleanor, take Nathan to be your lawfully wedded husband? I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Nathan frowned, confusion flickering across his face. Ellie? Tears filled my eyes as I shook my head. I can't, I whispered, my voice trembling. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and the officiant faltered, his expression a mix of shock and concern. Nathan's hands fell from mine, his face pale. Ellie, what are you saying? I'm so sorry, I said, the words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I can't do this. I fled the ceremony, my veil trailing behind me as I ran through the garden. The sound of footsteps followed, and I turned to see Nathan catching up to me. Why? He demanded, his voice breaking. Is it Lucas? The pain in his eyes was unbearable, and I couldn't bring myself to answer. Nathan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I trusted you. I trusted him. How could you do this to me? I never meant to hurt you, I said, tears streaming down my face. But you did, he snapped, his tone cutting. You've destroyed everything. Nathan left the estate that night, and I stayed behind to face the consequences of my actions. Lucas found me in the barn, sitting on a bale of hay with my head in my hands. It's over, I said as he approached. He sat beside me, his presence both comforting and suffocating. Ellie, Don't, I interrupted, my voice firm. We've already done enough damage, Lucas. It's time to let go. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. Months later, I found myself living in a small apartment in the city, starting over. The memories of the estate lingered, bittersweet and heavy. I thought of Nathan often, wondering if he had found peace, if he could ever forgive me. And Lucas. Lucas was a question I couldn't answer. We had shared something profound, but it had come at too great a cost. Sometimes, love wasn't enough to... Was Ellie right to follow her heart, or should she have stayed with Nathan? Share your thoughts in the comments.